On a busy city street, where the hum of traffic merged with the noise of the crowd, she saw her. A tall black girl with dreadlocks, walking with confidence, as if nothing in this world could shake her. Her hair, long, neat, like a living reminder of her culture and heritage, stood out in the crowd. And that is what caused instant disdain in the eyes of a white woman standing outside a nearby cafe. She literally froze in place, looking at her as if she were some kind of anomaly. Her face was twisted with hatred, her eyes narrowed, and a sardonic smile played on her lips. What a wild fashion. This is no place for such things, she muttered under her breath, but loudly enough for passers-by to notice her. As the girl drew level with her, the white woman couldn't help herself. It was as if something inside her was demanding that she speak out, that she pour out her poison. She stepped onto the sidewalk, blocking the way. "Do you think this is normal?" The woman's voice sounded sharp and arrogant. The girl stopped, casting a surprised glance at her. "Excuse me, what are you talking about? About your hair?" The woman nodded at her dreadlocks as if they were something disgusting. "Aren't you afraid that people will think you're a criminal? With your hair like that?" The words were spoken with such poisonous sarcasm that passers-by began to slow down. Interested in the brewing conflict, the girl frowned, trying to understand where so much hatred was in the words of this stranger. "My hair is a part of me," she answered calmly, but there was a note of tension in her voice. "A part of you? Are you sure that's normal? In our society?" The woman said with emphasis on "our," leaving no doubt that she considered the girl an outsider. The crowd around her began to slow down, people listening, some taking out their phones. The girl took a step back, feeling the atmosphere around her thicken. The white woman, as if getting a taste of her power, continued, "This is not Africa. We don't want to see this savagery. Do you think it's beautiful? It's ugly. It's disgusting." These words hit the girl like a whip. She clenched her fists, trying to control herself, but her eyes were already beginning to shine with anger and resentment. "It's just hair," she finally said. "No," the woman said, taking a step closer. "It's a symbol of the fact that you're not like us, and you never will be." This last phrase was like a sentence. The girl felt the crowd looking at her, some with pity, some with indifference, and some perhaps agreeing with the aggressor. The white woman was not going to stop. She already felt her superiority, her power over the situation. It was from this moment that the nightmare began in earnest. The crowd thickened, as if thirsting for a spectacle, turning the busy street into an arena. The girl stood before the white woman, her breathing growing heavy, but she did not retreat. A mixture of anger, pain, and inner strength was visible in her eyes. However, the woman, as if inspired by the attention of those around her, only gained momentum. "Do you even realize what this looks like?" She began with venomous sarcasm, looking at the girl's hair. "It's like you escaped from some tribal village. Is this a place for someone like you?" The voices in the crowd grew louder, some were whispering, some were clearly indignant, but no one intervened. The girl looked at the woman, trying to remain calm. "My hair is my culture, my pride," she replied, her voice sounding firm, but there was already a tremor in it. "Pride?" The woman laughed loudly so that everyone could hear. "Proud of it? Are you serious? In our society, people like you should be grateful that we tolerate you at all, and instead of trying to blend in, you flaunt your wildness." These words, spoken with contempt, struck like a knife. The girl wanted to say something, but the white woman did not give her a chance. "You think dreadlocks will make you strong? No, they only show that you are not like us. You are a stranger here. You will always be a stranger." The word alien sounded like a death sentence. The woman took a step closer, her face twisted with hatred. "Maybe you should look at yourself. You call this culture? It's dirt. It's a symbol of how you'll never be part of anything real. All you do is disgrace yourself and everyone who looks like you." The words weren't just an insult. They were an attack, aimed at the very core of her identity, her being. She clenched her fists, but she felt the air around her grow heavy, as if the street was narrowing, leaving her alone against that furious gaze and those degrading words. The crowd stood silently, as if assessing who would win this battle. Some looked at the girl with pity, some with curiosity, but no one intervened. Their indifference was as humiliating as a woman's words. And suddenly, as if trying to finally crush her victim, the white woman raised her hand and reached for the girl's hair. "You don't deserve to wear this. It's not your right," she hissed, tugging sharply at her dreadlocks. The girl instinctively retreated, her eyes wide with fear and shock. But the woman did not retreat. "If you want to look like a human being, then start with this. This hair is nothing more than dirty rags, and I will now show you how to get rid of the trash from it." The crowd froze. The anxious tension grew, turning the air into an invisible wall of fear and humiliation. The girl felt trapped, surrounded by looks and hatred that grew stronger. The crowd held its breath. The moment of confusion gave way to a growing murmur, as if those around them were trying to figure out if they were really seeing what was happening. The white woman, as if possessed by her own rage, suddenly grabbed the black girl by the shoulder, roughly yanking her forward a step. "You think you can just stand here and look at me like that? I'll show you where you belong." Her voice was loud, cutting through the air, drowning out the noise of the street. The girl staggered, but tried to break free. Her hands shot up to protect herself, but the woman tightened her grip on her shoulder, pulling her out into the middle of the sidewalk like a doll under the gaze of dozens of people. "Look at her! Everybody look!" the woman shouted to the crowd. "This is what happens when people like her forget their place." The whispers grew louder, becoming a deafening background. Some people were talking nervously, others were taking out their phones to film the scene. No one tried to intervene. Their inaction made the crowd silent accomplices in the scene. The girl looked at those around her, her eyes filled with tears, but she tried her best to maintain her composure. She felt her pride and dignity crumbling under the weight of their looks and words, like walls slowly crumbling under the blows of a hammer. "Are you afraid?" the woman continued, her voice growing more and more furious. "Come on, show everyone who you are. Show them your culture, your origins. You're pathetic. Just pathetic." She pulled the girl's hair sharply, her dreadlocks straining under the pressure of someone else's hand. The girl screamed, but tried not to show the pain, pressing her lips together so as not to give the woman even more satisfaction. The crowd began to whisper louder. "Why doesn't anyone do anything?" came a voice from the depths. "It's just hair," someone else said, clearly justifying their inaction. "This is not normal. Someone needs to stop her," the woman next to the man whispered, but she did not move. The white woman, feeling the crowd silent and watching, as if encouraging her actions, abruptly pulled the scissors out of her bag. The ominous glint of the metal in the sun made those around her gasp. The girl froze, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. "Is that all you can do? Come on, defend yourself. Or are you too weak?" the woman shouted contemptuously, raising the scissors to her hair. The girl tried to retreat, but the crowd behind her prevented her from moving. She was trapped, surrounded by indifference and fear. The white woman grinned cruelly and pulled hard on one of the dreadlocks, starting to cut it. "You'll thank me for this. You won't have to remind everyone where you came from anymore," she said through clenched teeth. When the first lock of hair fell to the ground, a wave of horror and shock passed through the crowd. The girl, standing in the center, pressed her hand to her head. Her breathing was ragged, and tears began to flow down her cheeks. But no one took a single step to stop what was happening. The atmosphere grew tense. The looks were full of condemnation, but no action followed. The girl, broken by humiliation, felt the world around her crumbling. The white woman continued to act with icy calm, confident that her actions were justified. The anxiety grew with each passing second. The people around realized that they had witnessed something far more terrible than mere aggression. They had witnessed injustice, indifference, and inhumanity, and their silence was as loud as the screams of the victim himself. The crowd froze, as if time had stopped, as the white woman clutched a pair of shiny scissors. Their metallic sheen reflected the light of the day, turning the moment into a sinister symbol of violence. She leaned slowly toward the girl, her eyes blazing with hatred fueled by nothing more than a sense of superiority. "Look at you," she hissed, grabbing one of his dreadlocks. "You call this beauty? You don't even know what it looks like. It's a disgrace. You're a disgrace." The girl gasped, trying to free herself. Her hands thrashed, but the white woman held her hair tightly. The first cut was loud, like a blow that tore through her soul. The dread fell to the ground, like a piece of her identity being cut off. "It's dirt!" The woman threw the hair at the girl's feet as if throwing out trash. "You think this makes you special? No, it shows who you were and who you will always be." Her voice was as cold as the steel of the scissors she used to sever the girl's connection to her culture, her pride, her personal history. Each new cut was accompanied by a flash of pain on the girl's face. "People like you should be thanking us for allowing you to be here," the woman continued. "But instead, you flaunt your origins. Well, I'll spare you that mistake." The crowd around her froze in silence. Some covered their mouths with their hands, not believing their eyes. But no one intervened. Their inaction only increased the girl's sense of isolation. Each new dreadlock that fell to the ground was like a symbol of loss, pride, dignity, strength. "There you go," the woman said with an icy grin, plucking another lock of hair. "Now you're starting to look like a human, although it still won't help you." The girl could no longer hold back her tears. They flowed down her face, mixing with humiliation that she could not express in words. She felt how every glance from the crowd became a brand, confirming her powerlessness. Her body trembled, but she could not break free, could not defend herself. "You even cried differently," the woman remarked with disdain. "Weakness. That's all you're capable of." Every word was like a whiplash, wounding her soul even more. The girl tried to drown out the pain by clenching her teeth, but this only increased the aggressor's rage. "Look, people are finally going to see the real you." The woman showed the crowd one of her cut dreadlocks. "That's what you all are, a pile of dirt that needs to be thrown away." The whispers in the crowd grew louder, but no one dared to approach. Some were filming, some were turning away, trying not to look at this horror. But indifference only increased the tragedy of what was happening. As the last dread fell to the ground, the girl clutched her head in her hands, unable to look at those around her. Her hair, her history, her pride lay at her feet, reduced to rubbish by the indifferent gaze of the crowd and the cold contempt of the aggressor. "You're nothing now," the woman said, taking a step back with a satisfied grin. "I hope you learn from this." But the lesson was not only for the girl. This humiliation, this cruelty, this embodiment of hatred left a mark in the air, heavy as fog, impossible to ignore. The girl stood in the center, surrounded by an invisible ring of silence. Her hair, now short and unevenly cut, lay on the dirty sidewalk like a symbol of her lost pride. The crowd, like a frozen wave, surrounded her, not for protection, but for spectacle. People watched, some with curiosity, others with condemnation, but not a single one took a step forward. Camera phones glared in the sunlight, capturing every detail of her humiliation. Some people's faces were filled with fear, but there was also a hint of guilt in their eyes. No one wanted to interfere. Time seemed to slow down, and each moment of this silent trial seemed to stretch into eternity. The mother and child retreated quickly, pulling the boy by the hand, as if afraid that this scene might somehow affect them. An elderly man opposite, leaning on a cane, looked at what was happening and shook his head, but did not move. A young couple stood a little further away, talking in low voices, but also did not move. Everyone in the crowd seemed to hope that someone else would intervene, but not them. Someone was laughing. The nervous laughter of several teenagers cut through the heavy silence, turning the scene into an even more monstrous spectacle. They pointed at the girl, whispering to each other as if her pain were a part of some show. Others simply looked away. An elderly woman with a carton of milk quickened her pace, her face expressing a clear desire to leave this place as soon as possible. A man in a suit, passing by, cast only a quick glance and, frowning, moved on as if none of this concerned him. The girl felt their gazes burning her, heavy, indifferent, curious. She could no longer hold back her tears. Her hands trembled, covering her face, but she understood that she had nowhere to hide. There was a crowd around, but she felt completely alone. The silence of the crowd was deafening. It seemed to say, "We see you, we see your pain, but it's not our problem." With each passing second, her sense of isolation grew, as if an invisible cage were growing around her, impossible to escape from. She was a stranger, not just to this woman, but to all these people who couldn't or wouldn't reach out. And only the sound of someone's footsteps on her fallen hair brought her back to reality. Someone from the crowd had accidentally stepped on her locks, not noticing how he had trampled her soul even further into the dirt. The girl raised her head and looked at it as a symbol of final loss. The crowd remained standing. Not a single person moved. And there was something in that silence that was far more cruel than the woman's words. It confirmed that she was truly alone in this world. The girl stood as if in the center of a heated arena, surrounded by a wall of indifferent faces. She felt despair squeezing her chest, displacing the last of her composure. Her hands were still shaking, covering her head, as if that could protect her from the sharp gaze of the crowd. But inside, everything was boiling. This injustice, this humiliation, they were becoming unbearable. And suddenly, she screamed. Her scream cut through the air like a bolt from the blue, breaking through the heavy silence of the crowd. It was a scream of pain, anger, despair. As if all the accumulated resentment, all the humiliation she had experienced at that moment was bursting out from the very depths of her soul. "Why are you silent? Why aren't you doing anything?" Her voice rang out, echoing in the silent crowd. She glanced at the people around her, her eyes a mixture of rage and pleading, as if she was trying to reach them, to reach their human heart. But all she got was emptiness. "You see what she's doing? It's not normal. It's wrong. You're all just like her if you just stand there and watch." Some turned away, avoiding her gaze. Others stood motionless, as if afraid that her words might affect them. Only a few people looked genuinely alarmed, but even they did not dare to do anything. The girl took a step forward, trying to escape this nightmare. She raised her hands to push away the white woman who still held the scissors, but she quickly retreated, as if confident that the crowd was on her side. "Do you think this will help?" the white woman shouted, looking at the girl with disdain. But the girl no longer heard her words. She turned to the crowd again. "You all see what she's doing. Why isn't anyone intervening? It's wrong. It's painful. It's humiliating me. She's depriving me of my life, my culture. Can't you see?" The crowd seemed to freeze even more. Her words penetrated their consciousness, but fear and indifference were stronger. Someone took a step back. Others just looked at each other silently. "That's your problem, not mine," one man whispered to his companion, looking away. Her scream grew louder, her gaze darting from one person to another, hoping to see some compassion, but instead she was met with cold indifference or confused faces. "Don't you understand? If you remain silent now, this could happen to any of you. Do you think you're safe while you're watching from the sidelines?" Tears began to stream down her face again, but her voice did not subside. It was a last desperate cry for justice, for humanity, for help. "Help me! I beg you!" Her scream echoed down the street, but no one moved. The crowd remained motionless, as if her words were just a sound and not a call. The girl fell to her knees, her hands clutching her head, and another scream burst from her chest. This one was quieter, but there was a sense of helplessness and desolation in it. Her voice carried over the crowd, but it seemed as useless as her tears. There were people around her, but she was truly alone. The crowd, like a frozen tableau, surrounded the girl, who was now on her knees, trying to protect what was left of her pride. But her hands were powerless against the cruelty that continued to play out before her eyes. The white woman, with cold method, picked up the scissors, now exchanging them for an electric razor, which she, as if prepared in advance, took out of her bag. She approached the girl slowly, and all that could be heard was the low hum of the razor, which tore through the air. The crowd froze, the hum of voices disappeared, leaving only a tense silence. The woman, driven by her twisted sense of power, grabbed the girl's head and tilted it, as if to emphasize her helplessness. The razor came down on her hair. Every movement was slow, as if deliberately calculated to humiliate the girl as much as possible. The locks of hair that were still on her head fell to the ground one by one, showering her shoulders and the ground around her. The white woman moved confidently, with a cold expression on her face, as if this scene was an act of justice for her. Each new cut seemed to symbolize the rupture of her identity. The hair that had been part of her culture, her expression, her history, now lay on the ground, reduced to nothing. The crowd was silent, and the silence was deafening. It became an invisible accomplice to the aggressor, intensifying the sense of isolation that had gripped the girl. She couldn't hold back any longer. Tears streamed down her face, falling to the ground, mixing with her hair, like a symbol of her inner pain. She grabbed her head with her hands, but it was no use. The razor kept moving, exposing her skin. The white woman moved with care, as if enjoying each new area that became bare. When it was all over, the girl was left on her knees, her head in her hands, as if trying to hide from the world that had so cruelly rejected her. She was sobbing, her shoulders shaking with tears, and her hair, her pride, her identity was strewn around her, a reminder of what had happened. The crowd began to disperse slowly. People turned away, walked away, trying to leave the place as quickly as possible, as if trying to erase this moment from their memory. But the trace remained. The air was filled with a heavy burden of injustice, humiliation, and destruction. The girl was left alone. On the ground, among the scraps of her hair, she lay, trying to collect herself, but she felt how everything she knew about herself collapsed under the weight of this moment. The world around her seemed to become cold, inhuman, empty. As the last razor blade completed its cruel work, the crowd began to come to its senses, as if emerging from a stupor. The whispers that had previously been mere background became louder. People looked at each other. Some whispered words of condemnation to each other. Someone shouted, "It was too much." The nervous tension in the crowd began to give way to a mixture of anger and shame. The woman who had just completed her heinous act took a step back, holding the razor in her hands like a trophy. She glanced around, but her confidence began to fade. Her cruelty had attracted attention she perhaps had not expected. A young girl from the crowd stepped forward, hesitantly, but with determination in her eyes. She knelt down next to the victim and tried to cover her with her scarf, to at least protect her from the gaze. The victim was still sobbing. Her body was shaking, and she could not lift her head. "Did anyone call the police?" The voice of a man standing to the side sounded loud and demanding. Those words shook the others. Several people reached for their phones. The shouts and whispers began to give way to concrete actions. Several bystanders began taking pictures of the white woman, capturing her face as she finally realized that the situation was spiraling out of her control. "How could you do this?" someone shouted from the depths of the crowd. Another person, an elderly man with a cane, came closer and, pointing at the woman, said loudly, "You will answer for this. It was disgusting." With each passing moment, the crowd became more and more dissatisfied. Someone began to shout at the woman, condemning her actions. Someone tried to surround the girl to create a kind of shield around her from human bodies. Suddenly, several more people approached the scene, who had been watching the events from afar, but now, having seen the result, decided to intervene. They began asking loud questions directed towards the white woman. "How could you? Have you completely lost your mind?" She began to back away, not as confidently as before. Now, she herself was the center of attention of the crowd, and her self-confidence was quickly fading. Some people took out their phones and began to record her face in close-up, asking her questions, to which she remained silent, looking away. Meanwhile, several people leaned over the injured girl. A woman with a bottle of water tried to console her, and a man in a denim jacket took off his sweater and put it on her shoulders. People began to talk among themselves, discussing how best to help her. The noise grew louder, the crowd shifting like waves in a storm. Someone was already on the phone, calling the police and perhaps an ambulance. The white woman realized that the situation had become dangerous for her. She looked around, trying to find a way out, but now she was surrounded by faces that were no longer passive spectators. The crowd, which had initially stood frozen in silence, was now alive with emotion, anger, condemnation, guilt for its inaction. It was as if the street itself had come alive, trying to make up for the horror that had just happened. The white woman, who had been enjoying her power a moment before, suddenly felt her confidence begin to crack. The crowd, previously passive and silent, was now coming alive around her, turning into an accusatory chorus. People were looking at her with undisguised condemnation, their gazes burning her like 1,000 needles. She stepped back, as if trying to block out the weight of those looks. Her hands still clutched the razor, but now it was no longer a symbol of her power, but a solid proof of her crime. For a moment, her eyes met the eyes of the girl lying on the ground. There were no words, but the pain reflected in those eyes was louder than any scream. The girl, hunched over and covering her head with her hands, did not look at the crowd. Her body was a trembling reminder of what had happened. Her tears ran down the dirty asphalt, mixing with her hair, which until recently had been her pride. The white woman froze. Her breathing became ragged. She began to understand the enormity of what she had done. The crowd no longer seemed indifferent to her. Each person around her now represented a judge whose silent sentence was becoming increasingly unbearable. The woman looked at the faces, angry, contemptuous, shocked. It seemed that even those who had previously been silent were now condemning her with their existence. She tried to take another step back, but her legs felt weak. Images of what she had done flashed through her mind. The scissors cutting her hair, the razor baring her skin, the girl sobbing beneath her hands. It all came crashing down on her now, turning into a hum in her ears that grew louder. Her fingers loosened and the razor fell to the ground with a dull thud. The sound seemed to echo down the street, drawing the attention of those who had not yet turned to look at her. She looked down at her hands, as if she knew that those hands were responsible for what had happened. A feeling she hadn't felt in a long time tightened her chest. Shame. It was more than fear of the crowd's judgment. It was the knowledge that her actions had been monstrous, that her hatred had destroyed more than just someone's appearance, but something much deeper. She tried to look away, but she couldn't. Like a magnet, her gaze was drawn back to the girl on the ground. The woman felt a sick feeling rising in her throat. She looked at the cut dreadlocks scattered on the ground like the fragments of someone's life, and suddenly she saw them differently. Not as a symbol she hated, but as pieces of someone's soul that she had destroyed. Her legs felt heavy, as if the earth itself refused to let her go. Suddenly, fear gripped her. She knew she couldn't just walk away. Everything she'd done would remain here, in those looks, those phones, that tossed hair. The woman stood motionless, surrounded by condemning glances and a heavy silence that seemed louder than any scream. Everything inside her was turning over. Her pride and self-confidence with which she had committed her act were now gone, leaving an emptiness filled with the awareness of what she had done. Before her, on the ground, lay a girl, broken not only physically but mentally as well. Her shoulders shook with sobs, and although her face was hidden by her hands, the pain and humiliation radiating from her trembling form were unbearably clear. Her hair, once a symbol of strength and pride, lay on the dirty ground around her like the devalued fragments of her personality. The woman tried to breathe, but each breath was heavy, as if the air had become thick and viscous. Her eyes returned again and again to those scraps of hair. Every lock now seemed to her proof of her cruelty, every glance in the crowd a sentence. Her hands trembled, her fingers mechanically tugging at the sleeve of her coat. She felt something cold rising from within, as if her own mind was beginning to reject what she had done. She tried to say something, to justify herself, but the words stuck in her throat. Everything she could squeeze out sounded so pathetic, so meaningless, that she herself fell silent. Her voice, when she finally dared to speak, was weak, almost inaudible. I didn't mean to." The words, swallowed by the weight of the moment, rang false even to her. She knew they meant nothing. The crowd looked at her with disdain. They were no longer passive spectators. Now each of them had become a witness, a bearer of her shame. She looked at the girl again. Images began to float through her mind, her hands cutting off lock after lock, her cold voice humiliating and insulting, her triumphant smile as the last dread fell to the ground. The images seemed to burn through her from the inside. Her fingers curled into fists, as if trying to hold on to something elusive. Perhaps the regret that had already taken hold of her completely. The woman opened her mouth again, trying to explain. It wasn't what I wanted. But she couldn't continue. All her excuses sounded meaningless, absurd. How could she explain what she had done? How could she justify the pain she had caused? Her attempts to justify herself only increased the weight of her guilt. She saw several people from the crowd begin to help the girl up. They gently supported her, wrapped her in scarves and jackets, creating a protective space around her. At that moment, the woman realized that she had lost something important. She had not just destroyed the girl's appearance, she had broken her pride, her spirit, her sense of dignity. And this realization, this understanding of her role in her humiliation, was worse than any punishment. It was a burden she would now carry with her. The girl, covered with the jackets and scarves of kind people, was still sitting on the ground. Her body was shaking, but not from the cold. It was the trembling of internal pain and vulnerability that nothing could muffle. People around her were whispering, moving. Someone was trying to calm her down, but her eyes, red from tears, were focused on one point. On the woman who stood in front of her, confused and finally realizing the horror of what she had done. The victim rose slowly to her feet. Her movements were slow, as if every effort was painful. She wiped away her tears, leaving only traces of salty moisture on her face. She no longer hid her head. Her bare skin, where dreadlocks had once proudly stood, now served as a silent testimony to what had happened. The crowd around her held their breath, watching her every move. Instead of turning away or breaking down completely, the girl looked straight at her attacker. There was a strength in her eyes that came from deep within her spirit. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was something more, a challenge, as if she were looking straight into the woman's very soul, forcing her to see the full weight of what she had done. The air was tense. The crowd waited for an explosion, perhaps anger, shouting, accusations that seemed destined to burst forth. But instead, something changed. The girl, despite the pain, stood with her back straight. Her gaze was hard, but there was no cruelty in it. Only pain and deep, agonizing disappointment. The white woman couldn't hold her gaze. She looked down, but it didn't save her. She still felt the weight of what she had done. The girl remained still, her breathing even, and there was a sense of inevitability in the air, as if this whole moment was leading to something greater. This was not a forgiveness that brings relief. This was a forgiveness that leaves a mark. It did not remove guilt, did not cancel what had been done, but it placed a burden on the aggressor that he had to carry further. In this silence, there was no vengeance, but a strength of spirit that cannot be broken. The crowd looked at the girl, now realizing that before them stood a person whose strength was greater than the hatred with which they tried to crush her. The atmosphere around them grew tense, but no longer from hatred, but from the realization that something greater than violence had happened here. There had been a confrontation in which spirit had triumphed over hatred. The crowd, once a silent witness, was now a living reminder of what had happened. The people around them stood in awkward silence, their faces expressing a mixture of guilt, regret, and confusion. Some looked at the girl as if trying to understand how she could find the strength to stand up. Others at the white woman who stood paralyzed, her eyes blank, her hands hanging at her sides. The locks of hair still lay on the pavement, like the remains of a girl's shattered identity. It was a physical reminder of the cruelty they had all allowed to happen by doing nothing. Hair, once a symbol of strength, was now a symbol of the crowd's silent consent. The white woman did not move. Her face was pale and her lips were trembling. She could no longer look at the girl or the people around her. Her inner world was in chaos. Her actions no longer seemed justified, and every glance thrown her way was like a hammer blow, shattering her confidence in the rightness of her actions. People began to disperse, but the tension in the air did not ease. Everyone left feeling as if they had witnessed something terrible that could never be erased from their memory. Some whispered quietly about what they would have done differently. Others led their children away, unsure how to explain what had happened. The older man, who had been standing at a distance the entire time, slowly turned back to the departing crowd. His gaze lingered on the woman and he shook his head as if to tell her that there would never be forgiveness for her. The young couple who had been filming put their phones away, but their hands were still shaking with the knowledge of their passivity. The girl, supported by a few kind people, walked away, her figure shaking, but her back straight. Her pride was shattered, but her spirit stood firm. She left behind a place that was now saturated with the weight of what had happened. For those who remained, this was more than just an incident. It was a lesson. Their silence was loud. Their inaction was as much an act as the brutality they had witnessed. This realization lay like a heavy stone on the hearts of everyone who stood in that crowd. The white woman finally sank to the ground. She did not cry, but her body trembled with an internal cold. Her remorse was not a momentary relief, it was a burden she now had to bear. She looked at the hair clippings scattered around her as a symbol of her own fall. This story was more than just an incident on a busy street. It was a mirror in which everyone saw their mistakes. It made them think about how indifference can be as destructive as the act of violence itself. And while hair can be grown back, pride can be restored. This moment left an indelible mark on the souls of those who were there that day. As the last people began to leave the scene, the street was still filled with tension. Even the wind, which usually carried the noise of the city with ease, seemed heavy, as if it could not bear the weight of what had happened. The girl was gone, supported by strangers who had finally decided to do what they had not done in time. But her absence left a shadow that could not be ignored. The white woman remained where she was. Her knees trembled, and she finally sank to the ground as if her entire world had collapsed around her. She covered her face with her hands, but she couldn't hide from what she had just done. Her action, which had seemed justified at first, now came crashing down on her with all its weight. She remembered every detail. The coldness of the scissors, the way her hair fell to the pavement, the look of horror and humiliation in the girl's eyes. These were moments that were now etched in her mind like painful, indelible scars. Her heart was pounding, not from fear, but from something deeper, the knowledge of her own cruelty. She tried to understand how she could have gone so far. The hatred that had seemed natural to her now felt like a poison that was destroying her from the inside. She realized that her actions were not simply an act of violence against someone else's appearance. It was an attack on the very essence of another person, on her soul, her identity, her right to be herself. The crowd echoed in the woman's head. They weren't shouting, they were silent. And that silence, reflecting their fear and indifference, now haunted her. She saw their faces as they stood there doing nothing. She felt their eyes watching her actions. But instead of blaming them, she realized that their silence was a mirror of her own hatred. She looked up and saw the cut hair lying on the ground. She saw it as more than just strands now. It was symbols of shattered pride, of a broken spirit. It lay mixed with the dirt like the remnants of something once great. She reached out to gather it, but her fingers stopped a millimeter away. She had no right. The hair was no longer hers, nor was a chance to make amends. People still glanced at her as they passed, some quick and judgmental, others long and full of contempt. Her face burned with their silent judgment. She felt as if she would never be able to lift her head again. Her crime was too great to forget, too obvious to forgive. Meanwhile, the girl who had been hurt sat in a small coffee shop a few blocks away. The people who had helped her had brought her water and tried to comfort her. She was no longer crying. Her face was expressionless, but there was pain in her eyes that was deeper than physical. It was the pain of knowing how easily the world could turn away, how indifference could become complicit in humiliation. Her hair was lost, but not her spirit. She knew that this moment would not define her life. She understood that her strength was in her ability to endure no matter what. She had lost the outer part of her identity, but what was inside had only grown stronger. And though the scars of this day would remain with her forever, she was determined not to let hatred destroy her. Later, when the incident hit the news, bystander videos went viral. People around the world watched the horrific moment and wondered, why didn't anyone stop her? The question became more than just a question about this street or this day. It became a challenge to the humanity of everyone who witnessed the story. The white woman saw the videos too. Her face was on every screen. Her actions were discussed. She was judged. She lost her job, her friends, her reputation. But none of that compared to what she felt inside. She lived with a burden she couldn't let go of. Her remorse was genuine, but she knew forgiveness wasn't her right. For the girl, this day became a reminder of her strength, her ability to forgive, even when it seemed impossible. She continued to live, but now her story inspired others. She became a voice for those who faced injustice, a reminder that even in the darkest moment, you can find light. The story left a mark not only on the lives of these two women, but on the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. It became a lesson in how easy it is to become part of evil through your silence. But it also became a reminder that every choice, every reaction can change someone's destiny. And maybe the world became at least a little bit more attentive. Friends, this story does not leave anyone indifferent. Write in the comments what you think about it. Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? How did you cope with it? Your thoughts are very important to us because together we create a space where every voice matters. We truly appreciate each of you. You are our support, inspiration, and strength. Thank you for being with us, for your comments, likes, and kind words. This helps us develop and create stories that make us think. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it if you think such topics should be discussed. We appreciate your activity. It makes us stronger. We wish you a good day filled with kindness, understanding, and warmth. Remember, together we can make the world a little better.